a silent corridor, a hushed name, and a single envelope marked private. Royal aides rushed between chambers, their faces pale. What was supposed to be a calm royal morning turned into a frenzied alert. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Charles knows. The moment that would set Buckingham Palace ablaze had just begun. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with the arrival of an unremarkable man, a courier no one could identify. He bypassed routine protocol and handed a sealed envelope to the king's private secretary, whispering only, "This must reach His Majesty directly." Within minutes, the letter changed hands and vanished behind the heavy doors of the king's inner chambers. The air shifted. There was no announcement, no sirens. Yet the mood across the palace turned electric. Staff exchanged glances, some stiff with fear, others sensing opportunity. They didn't know what was inside the envelope, but they knew it was meant to break something open. Inside, Charles unfolded a set of documents that would rupture the fragile peace the monarchy had fought to protect. It wasn't just numbers. It was a betrayal dressed in accounting codes, offshore figures, and the unmistakable signature of his brother. The king sat still for a long time, his fingers clenched tightly around the papers, eyes flickering with a quiet rage. Not a word escaped his lips, yet his silence echoed like thunder down the marbled halls. He cancelled all public appearances, signaling to insiders that something monumental had erupted behind the scenes. Royal aides were thrown into motion, summoned to assemble an emergency council without explanation. Couriers darted between residences. Security teams doubled their posts. The palace hadn't seen this level of internal mobilization since the passing of the Queen. No one dared speak the name aloud, but it hovered there in every whispered conversation. Andrew, the man whose past scandals had nearly dragged the monarchy into collapse, was now linked to something even darker: financial misdealings that could not be dismissed as mere rumor. The council's call, made under veiled urgency, rattled those even on the fringes of royal operations. There was no briefing, no agenda, just an order to appear. Whispers filtered through the palace walls. The king had reached his limit. He wasn't just disappointed, he was ready for war. The betrayal wasn't political, it was personal, and unlike past controversies, this time, Charles held the upper hand, armed with proof, position, and a long simmering fury forged in the shadow of decades of quiet humiliation. The monarchy, already balancing on a precarious edge after years of scandal, was now standing at the mouth of a storm. And this time, the lightning would strike from within. The echo of high heels down corridors, the flurry of frantic aides, the sharp slam of doors, all of it built toward one terrifying truth. Confrontation was inevitable, and the man in Charles's crosshairs was unprepared for what was coming. But behind the closed doors of Windsor's drawing room, the king was preparing for a confrontation unlike any in royal history. They said. King Charles was composed, controlled, regal. But that morning, the monarch didn't walk into the private chamber he stormed in. What followed was a fiery clash between blood and betrayal. As Andrew sat waiting, his brother's first words cut like steel. "Is there anything you'd like to confess?" The door had barely closed before the tension ignited. Charles didn't offer a seat, nor did he extend the usual diplomatic pleasantries. Instead, he marched toward the center of the room and dropped a thick folder onto the table with a thunderous slam. Papers spilled slightly from the leather binding, revealing ledger entries, handwritten notes, and payment trails marked with red ink. Andrew, caught off guard, instinctively reached for the documents, but Charles's glare halted him mid-motion. This wasn't a discussion. This was judgment. For years, Charles had remained patient, perhaps too patient, as Andrew navigated scandals and disgrace. But now, faced with evidence too detailed to ignore, the king's patience had collapsed into fury. Charles demanded answers clear, direct, and immediate. His voice, though low, carried the weight of thunder. He called the figures a stain on the House of Windsor and warned that the monarchy would not survive another cover-up. Andrew, visibly shaken, tried to defend himself, claiming ignorance, denying knowledge, insisting the documents were forged or misunderstood. But his voice trembled. The denial lacked conviction. Years of entitlement had prepared him for scrutiny, but not for this kind of reckoning, not from his brother. not from the king. When Andrew tried to deflect blame toward outdated royal structures, Charles erupted. He brought up their mother, the Queen, and the standards she upheld. He reminded Andrew that her final years were spent protecting the institution from collapse, only to now see her legacy threatened from within. There was pain behind Charles's fury, not just rage but heartbreak. The betrayal cut deeper than financial impropriety. This was a brother who had been shielded, defended, even spared from the full weight of his past missteps. And yet, despite it all, here they stood again, another scandal, another disgrace, another royal wound that would bleed in public. Charles didn't just speak as king, he spoke as a brother pushed to the brink. He referenced past scandals, the silence they were forced to maintain, the negotiations they endured, the shame they buried. And now this, a deception wrapped in financial darkness that had reached the throne itself. Staff members stationed outside the chamber later described muffled, shouting raised voices that escalated with each passing minute. Some said they heard Charles utter words rarely spoken in royal circles. Others claimed Andrew's voice cracked under pressure, his denials turning desperate. What no one could deny, however, was the atmosphere of collapse. The old boundaries of royal loyalty had ruptured. Something irrevocable had broken between them. But while Andrew staggered under the weight of his brother's wrath, the worst was still to come. Because what Charles had confronted him with was only the beginning, only what had already surfaced. There were more files, more whispers, more names. The first blow had landed, but the second wave would change everything. And just when Andrew thought the storm had passed, a second wave of accusations emerged, darker and far more damning. Buried within old financial records was something no one expected to find: a paper trail of transactions tied to shell accounts and foreign entities. The documents weren't just incriminating, they were explosive, and they led straight back to a source the palace thought had been silenced years ago. What began as a routine internal audit soon spiraled into a full-blown crisis. A junior member of the Royal Financial Advisory Team, buried beneath boxes of archived reports, flagged inconsistencies that didn't match any known expenditure. At first, it seemed like an error: numbers out of place, dates not aligning, recipients with no traceable identities. But with every ledger opened, the holes widened. Patterns emerged: unusual transfers routed through offshore entities, seemingly charitable in name, but unrecognizable to official registries. There was no warning, no heads up, just quiet panic building within the heart of the monarchy's financial machinery. The charities in question weren't new. They were foundations long associated with Prince Andrew's name, established during quieter years when public scrutiny had lulled. But behind their noble facades lay links to jurisdictions known for secrecy and shadow deals. The payments, though staggered and camouflaged, bore a disturbing rhythm. From one trust to another, funds circled the globe, ultimately landing in accounts with no declared purpose. What shook the audit team most wasn't the size of the funds, but the consistency. This wasn't a one-off mistake, it was a system that operated in silence, protected by royal immunity and buried beneath years of neglect. One name appeared more than once on forms, approvals, and authorization letters: Prince Andrew. His signature was unmistakable. Royal protocol dictated that senior royals remain at arm's length from the financial minutiae, yet here was proof that Andrew had signed off on payments that bypassed every expected safeguard. When the preliminary findings were handed directly to Charles, the king reportedly locked himself away for hours, reviewing each page in stunned disbelief. Sources later whispered that it wasn't anger that consumed him, it was grief. Grief at the realization that the damage wasn't historical. It was active. Behind the palace walls, panic began to spread. Not over what had already been discovered, but over what could still be hidden. One whistleblower from within the Crown estate came forward anonymously, urging a full-scale forensic investigation. "This goes deeper," the message read. And he's not the only one who knew. That single line set off a wave of fear. If others were involved, if others within the royal structure had turned a blind eye, then the scandal wasn't just about one man. It was systemic. It was contagious. As the internal debates began, the royal household fractured. Some argued for transparency, believing a controlled release could salvage integrity. Others urged silence, fearing the monarchy could not withstand another public shaming. The very foundation of the institution trembled under the weight of indecision. And yet, for all the forensic evidence now stacked within Windsor's private archive, the most haunting question remained unanswered: who had protected this operation for so long? But even as investigators dug deeper, the biggest threat wasn't the numbers, it was who else knew. As palace walls trembled under scandal, Queen Camilla pulled Charles aside with a warning that chilled the king. If this gets out, it won't just be Andrew they'll come for. Her words weren't out of loyalty to the disgraced duke, but fear of what might surface next. In the stillness of a drawing room lined with decades of royal history, Camilla spoke with a rare urgency. She had seen scandals rise and fall before, but this was different. This was foundational. Her voice, usually so composed, trembled slightly as she urged Charles to pause to think carefully. The world might believe the monarchy had withstood the worst of storms, but behind the gilded image lay delicate fractures, and this scandal threatened to split them wide open. It wasn't only about Andrew anymore, it was about the structure they had all inherited. One built on traditions, legacies, and blind spots. Camilla feared what a full audit might truly reveal. Too many hands had passed through the crown's complex web of trusts, donations, and quiet favors over the decades. Records, once cons, eyed irrelevant, could suddenly take on lethal weight in the hands of the press. She whispered the names of long-retired aides, former patrons, even distant cousins whose financial entanglements had been buried and forgotten until now. If Andrew was exposed and dragged before the public, would they stop there? Or would the monarchy itself be dismantled piece by piece in the court of opinion? Charles listened. But his expression gave nothing away. For a moment, the king looked older, worn down by the burden of truth. He admitted, in a voice so low it nearly vanished, that too many shadows had haunted the family for too long. He spoke of his mother's reign, of how Her Majesty had kept the crown above chaos with quiet control, shielding the public from its darker truths. But that era was gone. And now he stood at a crossroads: preserve the family through silence, or protect the monarchy by exposing the rot. The palace, meanwhile, fractured. Senior staff were split down the middle, some aligned with Camilla's instincts: contain the damage, silence the leakers, protect what's left. Others believed the only hope of survival was transparency: rip off the veil and let the world see them bleed, if only to prove they still had a soul. Backroom conversations turned venomous, trust dissolved overnight. Even long-time aides began questioning each other's loyalty, wondering who might turn whistleblower next. Camilla, ever the strategist, urged caution. She feared Charles might act on principle rather than politics. She warned that one misstep, one overcorrection, could destroy not just Andrew, but the fragile alliances keeping the monarchy from collapse. Charles, torn between his crown and his conscience, offered no easy answer. Their conversation ended not with a decision, but with a silence that weighed more than words. And while the royal couple debated discretion, another royal Iga was preparing to act, and she wouldn't wait for permission. She's always been the no-nonsense royal. But when Princess Anne got wind of Andrew's alleged dealings, she did something no one expected. She marched straight into the king's study and said, "This isn't about family, it's about integrity." And just like that, the palace had another storm to contain. Anne had heard whispers before the file even reached her hands, but she didn't act on rumors. She waited until the official documents were slipped under her door, unredacted, complete, and damning. She spent the night poring over the evidence, lips pressed thin with disbelief, eyes narrowing with each page. There were no excuses here, no misunderstandings. It was betrayal, plain and direct. The next morning, before aides could stop her, she entered Charles's private quarters without announcement. Her voice didn't waver. There were no pleasantries, no diplomatic framing. She demanded action, not because of who Andrew was, but because of what the monarchy still claimed to be. Charles wasn't unprepared for Anne's reaction, but he wasn't ready for the weight of her words. Anne didn't just want accountability, she wanted removal. She urged her brother to strip Andrew of all remaining privileges, stating bluntly that keeping him in the public eye would poison the institution further. Behind closed doors, the conversation turned heated. Charles pleaded for a pause for time to navigate the implications, but Anne cut through the hesitation. "Every second we hesitate," she warned, "we tell the world we're complicit." The clash between brother and sister was not just political, it was personal. Anne had long borne the burden of being the monarchy's most disciplined figure. She never sought headlines, never courted favor, and yet she stood firm in the shadow of brothers who had repeatedly dragged the crown through crisis. Her patience had thinned to the breaking point. She drew a line and dared anyone to cross it. Public distancing wasn't a suggestion, it was a necessity. Anne proposed an immediate internal memo, stating that no working royal would appear alongside Andrew in any official capacity. It was a strategy laced with quiet fury. Her stance came with consequences. She refused to attend upcoming royal engagements if Andrew remained scheduled to appear. Quietly, she informed select staff that she would not share a platform, a carriage, or even a photograph with him. Her absence from those events would not go unnoticed. But Anne didn't flinch. She was ready to absorb the fallout. Her loyalty to the monarchy was greater than her loyalty to blood. Charles, already worn from days of confrontation and sleepless deliberation, now faced another agonizing decision. The pain of watching his family fracture under the weight of truth was visible, but the image of Anne, unshaken, unwavering, and armed with moral clarity, refused to leave him. He could no longer delay. The cost of inaction was now measured not only in scandal but in the very foundation of the family's credibility. But before Charles could take his next step, another royal wildcard entered the scene, and this time the media was watching. Prince William didn't mince words. In a hushed meeting that would soon leak, he reportedly told his father, "Either he goes, or I do." It was the beginning of a generational rift, one where the future king refused to inherit a monarchy tainted by silence. The room fell quiet the moment William spoke. There was no dramatic outburst, no raised voice, just a single piercing ultimatum. It wasn't the voice of a son challenging his father, it was the voice of a future monarch drawing a line in the sand. William had been silent long enough, watching scandal after scandal be absorbed into the royal fold, swallowed by tradition and masked by vague statements. But this time, it was different. This time, the institution itself was at stake, and he would not inherit a legacy built on compromise and decay. Charles, weary and torn, met his son's stare with the weight of 1,000 decisions pressing on his shoulders. He knew what William's demand meant, not just for Andrew, but for the entire balance of power within the palace. It wasn't merely about exile or image, it was about a philosophical divide between the old world and the new. Charles still believed in process, in diplomacy, in internal handling. William, however, saw the writing on the wall. Public accountability was no longer optional, it was survival. Beside him, Catherine stood firm. Though she said little, her silence was not passive. Her support was unwavering. She understood what was at stake, not just reputationally, but generationally. She knew their children were watching, and that the monarchy they would one day represent could not be built on the broken scaffolding of unresolved scandals. Together, William and Catherine formed an unshakable front, demanding clarity, action, and most importantly, truth. The debate raged behind closed doors. Senior advisors argued over protocols, precedents, and reputational damage. Some urged caution. Others feared the precedent of sacrificing a senior royal to media pressure. But William wasn't asking for vengeance. He was demanding integrity. He argued that silence was no longer neutrality, it was complicity. And the cost of complicity would be the trust of the next generation. That was something he was not willing to lose. Soon, parts of the meeting began to leak. Small details, snippets of conversation, hints of a standoff between monarch and heir. The press latched on quickly, spinning stories of a fractured household, of a son ready to walk away from his birthright. But instead of recoiling, the public rallied behind him. Polls shifted, sympathy moved. The people weren't shocked by Andrew's scandal, they were watching to see if the monarchy would finally choose principle over protection. Inside the palace, however, the leak was another tremor in an already collapsing foundation. Charles found himself surrounded by division, haunted by the looming reality that every decision he delayed risked alienating the very future of the crown. The man who had waited a lifetime to reign was now being pulled in opposite directions by duty, by blood, by legacy, and by the son determined not to repeat his father's mistakes. But as the royal family fractured from within, the outside world was beginning to hear whispers, and they were growing louder. It started with a headline, then a breaking news alert. By midnight, Andrew's name trended globally alongside damning allegations and royal silence. Someone inside had spoken, and now there was no going back. The palace's walls weren't just cracking, they were collapsing. The media firestorm erupted without mercy. An exclusive from a major tabloid exposed detailed financial records allegedly linking Prince Andrew to offshore transfers, questionable charity funding, and hidden accounts. What had been whispers behind palace curtains now thundered across television screens and social media feeds. The article came armed with dates, names, figures, and footnotes. It wasn't speculative, it was surgical. By the time the palace press office received the early copy, the story had already gone live, spreading like wildfire. Screenshots surged across the globe before royal courtiers could even finish reading the second paragraph. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. Hashtags surged. Online petitions demanded transparency. Commentators who had long tiptoed around the monarchy now spoke with unfiltered red fury. The idea of royal immunity no longer held the power it once did. People weren't merely angry at Andrew. They were enraged at the silence that surrounded him. For too long, the crown had responded to crisis with formality and vague platitudes. But this scandal couldn't be contained by tradition. It demanded reckoning. Charles, still reeling from the internal chaos, was forced to cancel 2 major engagements within hours of the leak. The official excuse cited scheduling adjustments, but no one bought it. The truth was written across every headline. Photographers stationed outside Clarence House captured an image that would circulate for days: Queen Camilla leaving in haste, face drawn, expression unreadable. Speculation swirled. Some said she'd stormed out. Others claimed she was shielding Charles from further questions. Whatever the truth, the optics were disastrous. Inside Andrew's camp, panic set in. His private team, already fractured and diminished from years of previous crises, scrambled to piece together a response. Statements were drafted and scrapped within minutes. Legal advisors warned against specifics. PR officials begged for a firm denial. But the damage was too vast. Every silence felt like confirmation, every delay an admission. And when Buckingham Palace finally released an official statement, it was devastating in its ambiguity. "We are aware of the recent media reports and are reviewing the matter internally," it read. No denial, no defense, no clarity. That single paragraph became the fuel for endless speculation. News anchors dissected every word. Former royal aides were brought on air to guess what reviewing internally might really mean. The absence of Andrew at scheduled appearances was noticed immediately, and when aerial shots captured blacked-out vehicles entering private royal estates, theories spiraled into hysteria. But perhaps the most damning silence was Charles's. The king, so often measured and composed, now faced a crisis that could not be resolved behind closed doors. The monarchy had been breached not by external scandal, but by a leak from within. Someone had spoken. And the silence that followed was not a shield, it was a spotlight. As the media storm intensified, there was only one way forward, and it would require the unthinkable. No cameras, no fanfare, just a cold, ancient room where history has been made for centuries. This time, it wasn't about crowning a monarch, it was about removing one of their own. And when the final vote was cast, Prince Andrew's fate was sealed in silence. The Royal Council, summoned in secrecy, convened with urgency not seen since the darkest days of the monarchy. Invitations weren't extended, they were ordered. No press releases, no briefings, just whispers in corridors and urgent footfalls behind palace doors. The gathering was small, but the stakes were immeasurable. Each attendee bore the weight of history, of bloodlines, of a public watching with sharpened eyes and long memories. The question wasn't whether Prince Andrew had damaged the crown. The question was whether the crown would now finally respond. Charles, pale and pensive, presided over the chamber. For days he had wrestled with the impossible choice: preserve the illusion of unity or restore the credibility of the monarchy. Anne sat opposite him, arms folded, unwavering. William remained resolute, his stance already known. Others hesitated, fear clashed with duty, tradition battled modern expectation. And then the vote was called. No speeches, no justifications. One by one, hands rose, each decision a fracture, each gesture a severing of what once was protected at all costs. When the count was final, the decision was absolute. Prince Andrew would be stripped of all remaining ceremonial duties, his royal patronages formally withdrawn, and his name quietly erased from future state occasions. Charles did not speak immediately. His silence was not indifference, it was mourning. He knew this decision would scar the family forever, but it had to be done. Not because of media pressure, not because of optics, but because the institution could no longer carry the burden of silence. At first, the decision was kept internal. A formal notice was drafted, locked away for future use, but the palace had underestimated the hunger of the outside world. Within hours, leaks spread like ink through water. The press reported it first as rumor, then with confirmed citations. By morning, the public knew what the palace had tried to contain. There was no celebration, no outrage, just a stunned stillness, as if the monarchy had finally blinked in the face of truth. Charles, in a rare and deeply emotional statement, addressed the public not as a sovereign, but as a father and a brother. He spoke of duty, of painful reckoning, and the need to protect the integrity of the crown above personal affection. His voice cracked on one sentence that would echo across generations. There are moments in leadership where love must yield to responsibility. Andrew, sources claimed, was devastated, not at the loss of title, but at the finality of it all. The doors that once protected him were now closed. The family that once shielded him had turned away. Discussions of him leaving the country circulated within hours. A quiet exile, far from scrutiny, far from scandal. No announcement, no farewell, just a quiet departure to a life where his name no longer held weight. But while Andrew vanished into exile, the aftershocks continued, reaching even the youngest generation. The monarchy had endured wars, divorces, and betrayals, but never had it faced such a personal implosion. As Andrew retreated and Charles stood alone, a new vision quietly emerged, one led by William, with Catherine by his side, and a single mantra echoing through the palace halls: never again. In the aftermath of the vote, with headlines beginning to fade and scandal cooling from a boil to a simmer, the real work began. William and Catherine, now the unofficial architects of a new royal era, moved swiftly but without spectacle. They didn't seek applause. They sought repair. Together, they initiated subtle but significant changes in how the monarchy engaged with the public. Fewer ceremonial displays, more community-focused outreach, less reliance on inherited privilege, more emphasis on earned trust. The tone shifted. The institution, once rigid and unyielding, began to soften, just slightly, just enough to let the people back in. Behind the scenes, Charles struggled with a storm of reflection. He had fulfilled a duty many believed he never wanted, punishing his own brother. Insiders spoke of handwritten letters, never meant for publication, in which he lamented the toll the scandal had taken not just on the crown, but on the family. One of them leaked, and its words sparked a rare sympathy from the public. "A crown worn in shame," he wrote, "carries no wig. HT worth inheriting." It was not a statement of weakness, but of sorrow. The monarchy had survived, but not without bleeding. Anne, resolute as ever, made sure the bleeding would not repeat. She spearheaded a quiet overhaul of internal processes, oversight committees, financial audits, independent advisors, all designed to prevent another Andrew from slipping through the cracks. No fanfare, no press conference, just quiet, deliberate reform. She had no interest in public approval. Her loyalty was to the crown, and that meant facing its flaws without mercy. Meanwhile, Andrew's estate came under formal scrutiny. What had once been dismissed as family finances was now subject to legal inquiry. The silence around him remained, but it no longer protected, it isolated. His name, once whispered with deference, had become an unspoken cautionary tale. The palace didn't deny the investigation, but neither did it offer support. The line had been drawn, and it would not be crossed again. Internally, the palace shifted. Staff were reassigned. Financial departments restructured. Loyalty was no longer enough competence, and integrity became the new currency. For the first time in years, there was movement not dictated by tradition, but by necessity, and slowly, cautiously, public sentiment began to shift. The outrage gave way to cautious approval. The monarchy hadn't hidden, it had acted. And that was enough for now. As one chapter of royal chaos closes, another begins, reminding the world that beneath the gold and grandeur, the Windsors remain a family tested by their own. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.